My name is Clara June Whitaker. I'm 38 years old. I live in a small bungalow on the edge of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the kind of house with a sagging porch swing and a lawn that fights a losing battle with crabgrass every summer. I work as a school counselor at a middle school 2 towns over. I drink bad coffee in the mornings, keep a file of emergency contacts that I update obsessively, and I sleep with the bathroom light on because the dark still feels too much like other people's sharp voices. Lately, my life has been a practical rhythm. Appointments, PTA emails, the kind of quiet that coughs sometimes like a cat at the window. Underneath it, there's always been that hollow place the size of one whispered sentence. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The sentence came at the airport. It was late November. The sky outside the terminal windows was the cold, clear blue of a Midwestern morning, and the heaters were on inside but doing nothing for the teeth. I remember the smell of burnt coffee and hot waxed floors, the tinny announcements that looped and softened every few minutes. My father had bought us breakfast from a small cafe that used the same cinnamon roll recipe for 20 years. He had been a large, lumbering man at the time. Thick hands, a voice that could fill a church, and on that morning his face was thinner than I remembered, like someone had taken the stuffing out of his cheeks. I was 12. My brother, Matthew, was 15 and trying very hard to look like he wasn't listening. My mother had been somewhere else that week, work obligations, she said, but she had been gone a lot lately. Late shifts at the hospital, then a flood of bottles that smelled faintly of whiskey when she came home. The papers were in a stack with the edges browned where she'd left cigarette burns. My father had been angrier, quieter. Sometimes I think he used to measure his love by the number of objects he could break without meaning to. We had arrived at the gate early because the plane was his way out. A job waiting in Arizona, or a chance to start again, or the oldest lie a man can tell to make himself feel grand. He had a free ticket for himself, a one-way that smelled of plastic and diesel. I remember the way his boots clicked on the tile as he paced back and forth by the glass, watching the jet bridge like a man given a last look at an old friend. "Clara," he said when he finally crouched down to my level. He smelled like aftershave and cigarette smoke, the combination that used to mean he had been somewhere without me. "Listen to me." I remember pressing my palms flat against the armrest of my seat because my hands shook. I tried to look brave, to gather that soft, insecure courage 12-year-old girls have in small bras and louder dreams. Matthew had his arms folded, jaw a hard line. My mother was on the phone in the corner, speaking too loudly about codes and patient beds as if the terminal were a hospital ward she could not leave. "Stay behind," my father said in a whisper that was meant only for me, or so I believed then. "Stay behind. Nobody wants you there." It wasn't a command dressed as protection. It wasn't a mercy. It was a verdict. I felt something inside me break that would not heal for years. A thin, clean fracture that echoed every time I tried to ask for a favor, every time I tried to take up space in a room. I sat very still and heard my breath in my ears, the boarding announcement like background static. My father hugged me awkwardly, the kind of hug men who don't hug often give. One arm, half an embrace, a hand on my shoulder like he was checking I was still a thing in the world and not a mistake. He didn't look like a man leaving to protect anyone. He looked like a man who had decided his life was somewhere else, and that carving a piece of us off his map would make sense in his head. Matthew said nothing. My mother mouthed, "She's fine." Bored. I watched him walk away, threading through travelers with his carry-on and a ticket in his teeth like a talisman. And when he disappeared into the jet bridge, I became the person he had pronounced unwanted. The terminal swam. I did not get on the plane with him. I sat under the harsh fluorescent light and learned the grammar of abandonment in one sharp, private sentence. After that moment, the house changed. The absence of a person can have weight. It presses into the floors, settles into the seat cushions, becomes a kind of weather. My mother began to shrink into the couch, the hollowness of her eyes replacing the lines that had been from smiling. Matthew turned his anger into a way of existing. He slammed doors, he refused to speak. He would come in at 3 in the morning and throw his jeans on the floor like a flag. The practicalities suffocated us while the emotional stuff was the heavy scent that nobody wanted to air. Unpaid bills, knotted telephone calls, a father's voice on a rarely answered call saying he would fix things, and an answering machine clicking like a metronome of lies. I learned to make myself small. At school, I sat at the edge of the cafeteria table and kept my voice low. At church, I sat in the back pew so adults would not ask that dangerous question of "Are you all right?" Because I never was. At home, I learned to become invisible in ways that protected me from being told where I did not belong, because he had taught me I could be dismissed with a whisper. That whisper became my skin. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I'll try to explain why I'm telling you this now. Because 30 years later, one small packet of mail found me and reopened everything with the same clean old pain. I still keep the boarding pass my father threw away. I have it in a shoebox with a ticket stub from a carnival and a prom corsage. The day I found the envelope, the sky had that same hard blue, and the memory of the airport came back like a bone being hit. I hesitated before I opened it, because there are some doors that, once cracked, let in drafts that chill to the marrow. When I slit the envelope, there was a note written in my father's shaky hand. "Clara," it began, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to answer. But if you ever want to know why, meet me in Phoenix, Tuesday. I haven't the courage to come home." I folded the paper back into itself until the creases fit together like a secret. My hands were warm from the cup of coffee I'd been nervously clutching, and my heart was somewhere very far away, in a departure lounge where the people who were supposed to love me had become strangers. I wanted to throw the paper away and pretend it never existed. I wanted to burn the past and see the shape of my life soften into something less painful. Instead, I did the only thing I ever do when a wound reopens. I researched flights. The years between the airport and the envelope became a canyon I learned to cross alone. After Dad left, Mom's drinking escalated until she started missing work, and the social worker from the school district knocked on the door with a clipboard. I learned to read the pattern of her moods the way you read maps. If the curtains were closed, it was a heavy day. If the kettle was left on the stove, we had caved into boredom. The morning after Dad disappeared into the jet bridge, the house smelled of cigarette ash and the cookie jar had an empty space where Mom's anger used to be stored. Matthew became the unofficial man of the house. He was 15 and filled with a resentment people double his age would envy. He did our grocery runs because he felt indebted to us in a way that made him brittle. I remember one winter afternoon, Mary Tyler Moore reruns on the TV, a dog-eared calendar with a photo of a lighthouse, and him throwing a bowl against the wall. The ceramic crunched like it was the last brittle piece holding something together. He said, "He left us," and then, surprisingly and without warning, he told me, "If you were gone, maybe he'd come back." "Don't say that," I whispered. "Don't say what?" He laughed, and in the laugh I heard a boy whose chest had been hollowed out. That line, that thought, sat in my head and held court. If I had not existed, maybe our father would not have left. The logic was grotesque, but grief can be an architect of cruel theories. It made me more careful, more apologetic with my existence. In high school, I volunteered for extra shifts at the diner after band practice, stayed late to wash pans so I would have excuse not to sleep at home. It was easier to be exhausted than to be awake and listen to the silence. Therapy was recommended by a counselor who had seen me hiding behind textbooks. I went because she was kind and because I needed someone who would not look away. "People leave for their own reasons," she said in one of our sessions, smoothing the edge of a paper cup like a comfort ritual. "And sometimes those reasons are about them, not you." But how do you grope for that kind of perspective when a whisper carved its way into your identity? How do you call a thing untrue when every instinct keeps replaying it like broken tape? I learned to question the voice. Was it mine now? Did it belong to my father, or to the man who taught him to say cruel things? These are the mental conversations that happen at 3 a.m., when your teeth are clenched and your body is a theater of anxious rehearsal. Romantic relationships were a graveyard of small misprisions. I dated men who liked me but not the way I liked myself. I married once, briefly, to a man named Henry who left because he couldn't stand the weight of my silence. The morning he told me it was over, he opened my medicine cabinet and asked if I wanted the pills that kept me sleeping. "You're half here, Clara," he said, as if he had been bright enough to diagnose me in a single sentence. "I can't live in the space you won't fill." His leaving was a blunt incision. I remember standing in the tub and watching the steam catch the light like small ghosts, the faucet dripping a count of seconds. I did not cry then. I had learned that tears can be used against you as proof you are a drama. Instead, I sat in the warm water and thought of the airport again, of a man who had practiced the art of departure as a lifestyle choice. Somewhere in those years I became a counselor myself. Maybe it was an attempt to understand the mechanics of abandonment on a clinical level. How children internalize blame, how the language of dismissal becomes vocabulary. Maybe it was simpler. I liked being the person who showed up. I liked the role. Could control it. I could help kids who thought the world had decided to forget them. I could provide a chair that would hold their weight without judgment. There were small wars inside the house that never made it to the outside world. My mother found religion for a while, the kind that required charity and quiet reflection. She donated our good dishes and said prayers she had never whispered before. For months she picked at me with a guilt that felt compulsive, as if by making me guilty she could unburden herself from the memory of failing us. How do you forgive a parent whose negligence is the scaffolding of your adulthood? How do you say to a woman who gave you life that she had been absent in the only way that counts? If this is resonating with you, please share in the comments. I'm reading everything. It helped me to know I wasn't the only one whose life had been signed in small cruelties. Matthew and I drifted into a coiled, complicated alliance. He would stand by me in public and then disappear into his own resentments at night. He accused me once of stealing the last of the coffee filters, and I nearly killed him with a look. Small things became tests that proved who we were to each other. The truth surfaced in odd forms. I found a box of letters in his closet once, letters from our father that were thin and apologetic. I thought about confronting him about demanding answers, but I had learned the weight of questions that changed nothing. I took one of the letters and read it in the dark. "Matthew," it said, "I think about you every day." There was a line about regret that dissolved into illegible scrawl. The note hurt more because it was unsent, because it did not specify why the man who had once hugged me awkwardly had so little courage. Years passed like the slow flip of calendar pages. Jobs, small relationships, a failed attempt at graduate school. I learned to manage the hollow in me, to keep it under the cushions where it did not show in polite company. But the envelope from Phoenix folded everything back together in a single rustle. It was as if the past had been a turned stone and someone had reached beneath it to find the insectarium of memories that had crawled around my heart. When I booked the flight, I told myself it was for reasons of closure and curiosity. Perhaps I thought there would be answers on the other end, a tidy box labeled "Why" that I could open and then throw away. I imagined there might be a reconciliatory conversation where two adults could parse the messy calculus that had been our family. I imagined a cigarette-smoked apology and a human voice explaining the choices it had made. I did not imagine the way the air in the hospital would smell like antiseptic and sweat, nor the way my own footsteps would echo in corridors that had known his. I flew to Phoenix on a Tuesday, the weather different than the blue I knew. Dry heat that smelled like someone had scrubbed away the humidity and left sharp edges of sunlight. The airport in Phoenix hummed with people who were not in my rhythm. Strangers with sunglasses, people who moved with the easy confidence of someone who was going somewhere. It made me feel like a character in a play, someone who had wandered in from a different scene. I had rehearsed what I would say. I cycled through a list of phrases like prayers. "Do you know what you did? Why did you say that? Do you remember me?" When I walked into the hospice wing of the hospital, the smell of lemon disinfectant hit me in the chest. The room where my father lay was a small square of light and machines. He had lost weight again. His cheekbones cut the skin like thin plates. The man beneath the sheets looked like someone who had given too much of himself away to a wrong cause. "Clara," he rasped when I entered, and there was a surprise in the tone that made my chest twist. He had the same voice, low and roughly shaped by years of being listened to only when he had tools in his hands. You said something at the airport. I started because starting where you were most wounded seemed both fair and necessary. You told me nobody wanted me there. He shut his eyes and opened them slowly, like someone who had been blindfolded for a long time. I said a lot of stupid things, he whispered. I said things I didn't mean. I didn't know how to be a man who could stay. Is that an apology? The question was small, but asking it felt enormous. In the silence, machines whispered like ocean surf. I didn't tell you then because I didn't have the language, he said. I thought leaving would make. He coughed. It would make something kinder for the rest of you. I thought if I left, you wouldn't see me do the things I was doing. You were doing what? My voice broke. Beyond the question, I wanted him to say one certain thing. I thought of a man confessing to a mistake that had a clear moral shape to it, a thing you could point at and name. He looked at me with an honesty that surprised me. Gambling, he said. Bills. People who were bad for me. I owed things I couldn't pay. I thought if I left, I wouldn't bring them back to you. It was not the thing my resentful imagination had landscaped. A second family, a crime, an extraordinary fracture. It was more cruel in its humility. An addiction to quick escapes, to the roar of a wheel, to that small machine that promised to return what life had taken. He had thought leaving us would be protection from his shame. Instead, he laced shame into my identity. I said stay behind, he whispered, because I believed I wasn't bringing anything good with me. I thought you'd be better off if you didn't watch. I did something cowardly. I told you to erase yourself because I was afraid you'd see me weak. There was no miraculous absolution in those words. There was no sweeping explanation that turned cruelty into noble sacrifice. He had been a man who chose to run, and in that running he taught me to fear my own presence. Is that all? Yes. My throat was a dry basin. Was that the only reason? No, he said, and the next thing he said was the kind of confession that loosens the bones in your chest. My father told me the same thing. It hit me like the unexpected slap of wind against a building. A generational echo. My grandfather had been a quiet man with calloused hands and a stern jaw. I had sat on his lap once as a toddler while he watched the TV with a newspaper over his knees. The idea that cruelty had been handed down like a watch from wrist to wrist felt like a rusted inheritance. He told me he remembered being a boy who hid under the porch during storms and heard his father say, "We didn't ask for you," to a woman who might have been a neighbor or a relative. He said it so matter-of-factly that the world spun. You see, he said, eyes filling with the dust of memory. Someone told my father the same thing, and it made him small. He made me small, and I did not know how to do anything else. I listened to him tell me that his cruelty was borrowed, that the words had a lineage like money passing from hand to hand. That knowledge did not ease the bruise it gave me, but it gave context. The man who had whispered I was unwanted had been trained to whisper first. We sat together in that small hospital room, two people who had been shaping one another across decades. I wanted to throw my coffee mug at him for the years of habit he had given me, but instead I remembered the smell of him when he had hugged me at the airport, aftershave and cigarette smoke, and the odd, terrifying tenderness that had lived in his hand on my shoulder. Pain does not cancel tenderness. Sometimes it sits with it like two mismatched roommates who cannot leave. He asked me, and this is the part that surprised me, if I would tell my brother the truth. If I would say that he had thought leaving was protection, not punishment. Matthew, who had made our home a courtroom of grievances, deserved to hear that his father had been a coward, not a traitor. I promised, more because the sound of my voice in a room that smelled of lemon disinfectant made me feel anchored, because making promises felt like pulling a line taut over a chasm. The conversation then turned to things I had not expected. My father's need to be forgiven, not by me necessarily but by the idea of family. He said he had written letters, that he had tried to send postcards and apologies, but they had gone unanswered or lost. He kept reaching back as if to catch a tablecloth that kept slipping. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I found myself thinking absurdly, a reflex of a storyteller who needs an audience. It felt like a childish thing to insert in a hospice room, yet somehow there was a narrative loop here that made me play-act the parts one had written for myself. Protagonist, antagonist, seeker. The truth is Messier. Old people die. Old mistakes remain. The revelation about the letters nagged at me. I wanted to know why I had never seen them. Had Matthew hidden them? Had Mom refused mail from the man who left? The questions spiraled into small prying. When I left the hospital that day, the sun made everything seem sharper, and the world seemed full of the smell of dust and the ache of unfinished sentences. At home, I found Matthew in the garage fixing an engine. He looked up when I came in, grease streaking his knuckles like badges. "Did you go?" he asked without preamble. "Yes." "How was he?" He grunted. "Sick," he said. "Old men get that way. Their guts go soft." I wanted to be angry with him for his nonchalance, for the way he had learned to make his pain into something practical, but instead I told him what Father had said about the letters, and about the plea that we talk. He wiped his hands on a rag and sat down at the workbench, head down. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he took off his cap and pressed his forehead into his palms like someone praying. "I burned them," he said finally, the words themselves a kind of confession. "Letters. I thought if there wasn't anything to remind me he left, then he was gone for good." "You burned them." The disbelief was sharp. "You threw away the only thing that might have explained why." "I hated him," Matthew said, and the rage in his voice was old and deep. "I wanted him to disappear. Seeing his handwriting would have been like a ghost that won't leave." I sat down, the garage smelling like oil and old metal. "You robbed us of the chance to know him," I said because I had to place the hurt somewhere. It sounded more like an accusation than a question. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting us." Protection. Another word that becomes a hammer in the hands of people who cannot hold grief otherwise. That night I lay awake, the ceiling fan buzzing a low, clinical turning, and I tried to reconcile the father who had whispered to me at the airport with the old man who had turned those words into apologies at the end of his life. I tried to make the map of him reconcile the islands. Gambler, coward, teacher of cruelty, child of a man who had been taught the same. The pieces fitted, but not into anything comforting. They formed a collage of a legacy that kept repeating itself unless interrupted. As the days went by, I kept going back into the past like an archaeologist, picking through the dirt of our lives for artifacts that would explain the why. I found a photograph in an old shoebox of my father in his 20s. Thick hair, smile like a promise. There was a receipt for a bus to Las Vegas, stamps, a stash of ephemera that read like a trail of a man who had always been tempted by the quick fix. Each item made him more human and less mythically monstrous, which was terrifying in its own way. We all hold the right to be small, to be wrong, to be taught cruelty by those who came before us. The question I started to ask, slowly and with a kind of emerging anger that felt like sanity, was, what do you do when you inherit someone else's cruelty? How do you keep from handing it forward? Confronting Matthew about the letters was the hinge on which the rest of our story turned. He had thought, in the way of hurt boys, that erasing evidence of pain would make the pain itself evaporate. Instead, it created a hollow where trust used to sit. There was a night months after the hospice, when words we had been holding like hot coals finally spilled. "You could have given them to me," I said. We were back in the kitchen, the light a single warm bulb that made the linoleum shine. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, a soft, honest thing that made the world muffled and small. "You could have given them to me to read. We could have known. Would that have changed anything?" He prided himself on practical answers. He stacked firewood in the garage the way he stacked his defenses, neat and methodical. "You think reading his letters would have fixed Mom? Would it have made him stay?" "No," I admitted. "But it would have let us see what he tried to say. It would have been evidence that he tried, at least in some way." Matthew's face softened. "He did try," he whispered. "He sent postcards. He asked around. He left messages. I threw them away because I couldn't stand the idea that I would see his name and feel the hurt all over again. What did you want, Matthew? For him to come back and fix what he broke? For a magic apology to mend everything? I wanted him to be small, he said. I wanted him to have fewer bones to break people with. The honesty in his voice was a kind of offering. It didn't absolve him, but it made the wound more public, less private. And sometimes naming a wound stops it from spreading to parts of you that haven't been hurt yet. We argued about forgiveness, as adults do when they have learned a little about the cost of holding grudges. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, I told him. It's about deciding not to let an old wound dictate how you behave with the people you love. He looked at me like I had said something dangerous. And what if I don't want to forgive him? Then don't. I was honest because I had been taught that honesty is a kind of mercy. But don't let that refusal corrode you into the same person that he was. It begets bitterness. Bitterness eats kindness. We were stilted in our rapprochement. Rebuilding trust looks a lot like mundane, slow labor. Shared chores, shorter silences, calls after storms. Matthew and I began to speak more often, at first in the uncomfortable language of people whose wounds had nearly driven them apart. He began to tell me things about his life that I had been too hurt to ask. Nights he spent in his truck to avoid the house, the day he had punched a hole in the wall and then sat on the floor and cried for the first time, the way he had gone to my father's last service because he thought letting him go in silence would be worse than hating him. The healing was not fast. Healing rarely is. It is a slow process of refusing to make the same mistakes, of learning to sit while your heart has a fever and refusing to medicate it with rage. We had arguments that would flare up again because memory is a live wire, and sometimes one of us would touch it and the shock would be raw. One night, months after the funeral, my mother called me in the middle of the night. Her voice was thin, tremulous like a radio on the edge of signal. I found something, she whispered. In the attic. A box. I drove over in the dark, the roads empty, my tires whispering against asphalt. In the attic, she had a stack of things she had been too ashamed to look at. A shoebox of photographs, a handful of old postcards to addresses we no longer used, and tucked beneath, a small cassette tape with Clara written on the label in our father's block letters. A tape. I smiled despite myself. Who still uses tapes? No one, she said. Except him, apparently. I didn't know. I thought I don't know. I put it away because I was afraid. We took the tape down to the living room, the old VCR and cassette player clunking like a relic. Press play. My father's voice filled the room, thin and raw and present in a way nothing else had been. He spoke in a slow, practiced honesty, addressing me directly. Clara, he said, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting you when I left. I thought I was doing you a favor. Maybe I was just doing what I always do. Run. I want to tell you that none of this was because of you. None of it. The room spun. My mother wept with a kind of small, bitter relief. Release and grief braided together. For the first time there was a mediated apology that we could play back and analyze. The tape had been recorded when he had been sober for a week, apparently, in a motel between jobs. He had been trying to get his thoughts straight, attempting a version of explanation that wasn't fully coherent. He left this for you, my mother said. I don't know why I didn't give it to you then. Because you were protecting us? I suggested softly. She nodded. I didn't want you to open old wounds. It hurt more not knowing, I said. It stitched doubt into my bones. Listening to his voice on the tape was like throwing light on a dark room. It did not remove the damage. It didn't change the fact that a 12-year-old girl had been told she was not wanted. It did let me hear a man who had been bruised in his own childhood, and who had held on to a particular language of small cruelties because it was all he had been taught. I found myself thinking about cycles, a phrase we use often in counseling like a hammer and nail metaphor. Cycles are real. They are strong. But they are not mandatory. You can decide to be a lineage breaker. I started to notice little things that mattered. The way Matthew texted a "you up" when I was 2 a.m. and needed someone. The way Mom started to go to a support group where women sat around, coffee cups like talismans, and told their stories like prayers. I learned that surviving was not a single heroic act. It was 1,000 small choices to be slightly kinder, slightly braver, slightly less alone. There was no tidy moment of forgiveness where we sang and held hands. That would have been a lie. What happened instead was quieter. A conversation about who we wanted to be. A setting of boundaries. Small rituals to remember the past without being owned by it. I burned the boarding pass one spring with a lighter in the backyard. Matthew watched me, and then he put his arm around my shoulder. For the first time in decades, a man tied to me by blood did not look like a shadow. A few days later, I found an old photograph in my mother's purse. It was of my father laughing with someone I did not recognize. I thought about his life, full of missteps and bad poker hands, but also of small, ordinary joys that did not make the news. The image complicated him. It made him human in a way that both infuriated and softened me. Time has a way of dulling edges without erasing the shape of what happened. It has been years since the tape and the funeral and the slow reconstructions. My mother volunteered at a clinic now, a place where she met women who had their own stories of leaving and being left by men who smelled like cigarette smoke and spilled promises. She learned to make soup for neighbors. It was small, but it was something. Matthew moved further away. Work took him west, and our calls became less frequent but more honest. We spoke about everything now, and when the old injuries resurfaced we had a language to address them. Trigger, we'd say, like a bookmark for when past things tried to read themselves into the present. As for me, I kept counseling. I work with kids who come from homes that look like my childhood did. Bare cupboards, names on the mail, a father who left a gap so big it becomes its own weather system. I tell them sometimes not the story of my father in full. Some wounds belong to the person who carries them, but I tell them about the smallness I learned and the choices I made to stop being small. One girl, a red-headed 7th grader with a laugh that sounded like it would break if you leaned on it too hard, asked me once, "Do you think the adults ever change?" I looked at her, the fluorescent light making her freckles glow, and I said, "Some do, some don't. But you can decide who you're going to be. Sometimes that is the only change that matters." I have a little ritual now when I feel the old whisper bubble up. Stay behind like a phantom voice at the edge of a room. Close my eyes. Breathe. I name the whisper aloud. That's him, I say, and then I choose a different phrase. You belong. Saying it feels strange and monumental. I tell it to myself like a truth I have to build, brick by brick. The last time I thought about boarding something, I don't mean an airplane, but the idea of starting a new life, was when Henry and I separated and I moved into a small apartment with a cat who wakes me at 5 a.m. and sits on my chest like a small, furry alarm clock. One day I considered buying a cheap piece of jewelry, a token of self that cost less than therapy and lasted longer than a bad night. I didn't want to be defined by a man's whisper from an airport, so I bought something that reminded me of the path I chose instead. A thin gold locket with a tiny photograph of my mother and brother and me, sitting on a picnic blanket when I was 14, all of us laughing in a photo that had the sunlight slashed across it like permission. I don't pretend to have finished growing. There are nights the old anxiety curls up in my gut and I can't unroll it. There are mornings when I hear a phrase in Matthew's voice and flinch. Our memories are not negotiable. They will be part of us as long as we live. But I have learned to be careful about who gets to define me. If this has hit home for you, if you've carried a whisper like that in your chest, know this. The voice is not the whole story. There are many people who will announce your absence as fact. There are others who will insist you belong before you can even speak. Choose the voices you keep. Sometimes people ask me if I forgave my father. I think about that a lot. Forgiveness is too tidy a word. What happened is more complicated. I accepted that he was a man who had been taught cruelty and that he repeated it. I accepted that he tried later, not well enough and not in time. I forgave him in the smallest, most selfish way possible, because holding his hate would have been holding myself hostage. I refused to pass that whisper to my child and to my students. I changed a line that had been repeated in my family for generations. Before he boarded, my father said a terrible thing. It was a sentence that catapulted me into a life of low-lit negotiations with myself. And yet, in the end, it became a spur. Forced me to ask questions and to make choices. It made me a mother, although not by biology in spirit, of the kids I sit with, of the siblings who call and ask ordinary questions. I learned to make room for my presence in rooms where it had been declared unwanted. If you're still with me, thank you. If this resonates, a like helps others find the story. Share your thoughts if you can. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. The lesson I keep returning to is simple and stubborn. People are taught to hurt, and often they pass that hurt down like a set of spoons. You can decide not to hand it along. You can choose to teach kindness to the next person who watches you. That does not make past wrongs disappear. It does not rewrite the whispered words. But it changes the inheritance. When I pass through airports now, I watch parents with their children. I see men and women grip hands and promise we're together. I am no longer the child who learned her own worth from someone who slipped out through a jet bridge. I am an adult who knows the sound of a voice that wants to shrink you, and I carry instead a different quiet, the steady, intentional sentence I have learned to tell myself every morning when my chest feels like a bruise. You belong.